Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into what is, I think, arguably the single most important ethical tightrope walk in the history of governance.
It really is. We're talking about the tension between judicial restraint and judicial activism.
And it's this ultimate dilemma that anyone who puts on a judicial robe has to face. I mean, what is the higher calling for a judge?
Exactly. Is it strict, almost, mechanical obedience to the letter of the written law?
Just follow the code no matter what.
Right. Or is it the moral imperative to intervene, sometimes aggressively, to ensure justice is actually done, even if that means stepping into new, difficult, or politically charged territory?
That's the line, isn't it? We're exploring this central tension, which really defines whether a court is just a passive referee or if it's an active guardian of our rights.
And if you're, say, preparing for a brief on comparative constitutionalism, or maybe you're just trying to understand why some big landmark court decisions feel so revolutionary while others feel, well, frustratingly passive, this is the deep dive for you.
It's your shortcut to clarity.
Our mission today is to synthesize a lot of historical and modern legal doctrine to try and uncover this golden balance in judicial ethics.
And we have a really fascinating comparative stack of sources to do
We
it.
do. We're going on a journey that moves across centuries and continents, and it really demonstrates that this legal struggle is, well, it's universal.
So where are we starting?
We start with the foundational principles established in the earliest Islamic governance, specifically under Caliph Umar. Then we jump forward more than 1,000 years to the U.S. Supreme Court's critical and very activist shift in the landmark 1962 case Baker v. Carr.
From there.
And finally, we'll analyze the really dynamic development of something called public interest litigation, or PIL, in modern Pakistan.
I think the cross-cultural and chronological approach is so vital. Because even though the terminology we use, restraint versus activism, is modern, the underlying challenge is ancient.
Absolutely. The core question we have to answer is fundamental. How do courts manage to protect justice and fundamental rights without, dominating or undermining the democratic institutions they're supposed to serve?
And maybe the even more critical question is the flip side of that. When does judicial silence, which often comes from a sincere desire for restraint, when does that cross the line and actually become an active denial of justice that demands a court step in?
That is the line. That's the tightrope we will be walking and redrawing throughout this entire deep dive. So I think it's best we start at the very beginning, over 1,000 years ago.
Let's do it.
Okay, so when we talk about the history of justice, particularly in early Islamic history, the name Umar ibn al-Khattab, or Umar as he's often known, is preeminent.
His reputation is, it's global.
Right.
It's synonymous with fairness and creating robust systems of governance.
It is. But what our sources really emphasize is his foundational contribution to judicial philosophy itself. He established a balanced jurisprudence that, amazingly, encapsulated both restraint and activism centuries before modern legal systems even had words for these concepts.
It's genuinely astonishing to me that this tension was not only recognized, but institutionally managed so early in history. Modern constitutional courts are still grappling with this balance every single day.
They are.
So what was the philosophical force driving Umar's system of justice?
The driving force was a recognition that law exists to serve justice, but that justice requires a profound sense of humility from the judge. The system he put into place required his judges, they were called qadis, to be acutely, constantly aware of the limits of their own authority.
And that brings us right to the concept of judicial restraint in the early caliphate.
It does.
So how was that restraint defined? Because it wasn't just about, deference to a king or an executive branch like we might think of it today. It was something deeper, more fundamental.
Precisely. The core idea behind this early form of restraint was really twofold. First, limiting the power of the state, and second, protecting individual dignity and privacy.
Oh.
Umar was deeply conscious that unchecked judicial authority could easily become a tool for societal control, for a kind of moral tyranny. He believed that judges should not overreach their mandate.
And especially not by doing what we might call moral policing today, right? Or launching these unwarranted investigations into the private lives of citizens.
That was the absolute core of it. And this is perfectly encapsulated in that famous, powerful instruction he gave to his judges. It's a masterpiece of legal philosophy.
It really is.
He strictly warned his qadis, Do not search for people's hidden faults. Judge only by what is visible.
Okay, let's stop there and really unpack the immense legal implications of that command, because it's so much more than just a polite suggestion.
It's a foundational rule of law.
Right. So if a judge is instructed not to search for hidden faults, what does that fundamentally restrict the court from actually doing?
It fundamentally restricts the court's entire scope of inquiry. It means the judicial process has to stick strictly to the evidence that's presented in front of it, the visible acts.
Not speculation.
No. It prevents judges from engaging in these speculative investigations of a person's private intent, their motivation, their hidden morality. It forces the court to rely on objective, verifiable standards of proof.
Which is the cornerstone of what we now call due process.
The absolute cornerstone.
So the law is effectively saying, if a person commits an offense privately, and that offense isn't visible or it isn't brought forward through verifiable testimony from a witness, the state, acting through the judiciary, has no business expending its resources or its effort to root it out.
Yes. And that acts as a massive bulwark against a surveillance state.
A huge one.
Absolutely. The analysis in our sources highlights that the purpose of this stringent restraint was crucial for maintaining a free and stable society. Well, first, it protected individual privacy, which was seen as sacred. Second, it prevented the judicial system from becoming this perpetual tool of, state-sanctioned espionage against its own citizens.
And it kept the focus on law, not morality.
Precisely. It ensured that court judgments were based on concrete legal facts, not on a judge's subjective moral campaigns. Think about it. If a judge were constantly empowered to seek out the hidden flaws in every single individual who came before them, the legal system would become arbitrary.
It would lead to constant societal mistrust and friction.
Yeah.
People would be terrified of the courts.
Exactly. So restraint, in this context, wasn't just a passive choice. It was an active requirement for civil stability and for liberty.
That sets the stage for restraint beautifully. But as the sources immediately remind us, this highly restrained system was led by a man who also completely understood the necessity of judicial activism. So how did the need to intervene, to go beyond strict legalism, how did that emerge from the very same philosophical source?
It emerged from the deep-seated Islamic principle of equity and the ultimate purpose of Sharia, which is the welfare of the people. They call it maqasid al-Sharia.
The objectives of the law.
The higher objectives of the law. So, restraint, as we just discussed, is the rule for ordinary times. But when a strict adherence to that rule leads to a patent, obvious, catastrophic injustice,
then the circumstances become extraordinary.
They become extraordinary, and that demands intervention. The most cited and really the most iconic example of this is what happened during the year of severe famine. It's sometimes known as the Year of Ashes.
This is where we see the law bending without actually breaking.
Yeah.
This is the suspension of the had punishment for theft during that crisis.
Exactly. Now, had punishments are those specific penalties that are very strictly prescribed in the foundational religious texts for certain major offenses, like theft.
They're mandatory.
Under normal circumstances, yes. The qadis would have been obligated to impose that mandated penalty upon clear evidence of theft. But during this profound famine, which brought mass starvation to the entire region, Umar suspended that prescribed penalty.
And this is a critical point here, and one the sources really stress. He did not legally sanction theft. He wasn't encouraging it. The act itself was still considered wrong.
That's right.
But he was essentially applying a defensive necessity on a mass systemic level.
That is the core of the legal wisdom on display. He recognized that the extreme economic duress, the extraordinary circumstance of mass starvation, it mitigated the culpability of the offender.
Because theft, in that moment, was often just a matter of survival. It wasn't criminal intent driven by greed or malice.
Right. Applying the strict standard law in that context would have led to thousands of maimings or other punishments that would have been profoundly disproportionate and therefore unjust.
This was judicial activism in the purest service of equity. It was a conscious decision by the ultimate judicial authority to temporarily override the letter of the law. Because the dire spirit of the situation would undermine the foundational purpose of the law itself.
Which is the maintenance of justice and human welfare. This kind of action requires immense courage and wisdom from the judiciary. It's a declaration that the law is not some rigid, lifeless code. It has to breathe and adapt when basic human rights or even survival are fundamentally compromised by forces outside an individual's control.
So this is what created the duality.
It is the duality that provides the template for our entire deep dive today.
The strict law is for ordinary times, Equity is for extraordinary circumstances.
Precisely. This template established that judicial wisdom demands two things. First, respecting limits when the system is functional and stable, that's restraint. And second, possessing the courage to step in when justice fundamentally demands a deviation from the norm, that's activism.
And this foundation of balanced situational judgment sets the stage perfectly for examining how modern constitutional courts, which often lack a caliph's unitary authority, interpret and apply those same extraordinary circumstances.
It's a perfect transition.
So now we make that leap across history and continents. We're fast-forwarding over a millennium to 20th century America, where the exact same dilemma, when must the court intervene to prevent systemic injustice, played out over fundamental democratic rights.
We are diving into the dramatic shift from pure judicial restraint to full-blown activism in the landmark case of Baker v. Carr.
And this American example is so pivotal because it demonstrates the critical failure mode of restraint.
It shows what happens when judicial deference stops being a virtue and, over decades, becomes a source of entrenched, self-perpetuating political injustice.
So before 1962, the U.S. courts had this doctrine they loved to hide behind, the political question doctrine. For decades, they refused to hear any cases related to what the sources call vote dilution and grossly unequal legislative districts.
And to understand the injustice here, you have to look at the practical situation on the ground at the time.
Right.
Legislative district boundaries. These are the districts that determine representation in your state assemblies and, indirectly, in Congress. They had become grotesquely skewed.
Especially in states like Tennessee, which was the central state in Baker v. Carr.
Exactly. Many of these districts hadn't been redrawn since the early 1900s. So while cities were booming in population, rural districts with tiny populations retained the exact same representation power.
And you had these scenarios where a district in a booming metropolis like Memphis might contain, say, 50,000 or 100,000 voters.
Or more.
But an adjacent rural district with maybe only 2,000 voters was still allocated one representative in the state legislature.
That's the specific detail that makes the injustice so palpable. The difference was sometimes 10 to 1, or in some cases even 50 to 1 in representation per capita.
Unbelievable.
And it meant that the rural, often conservative voting minority held this vastly disproportionate power over the state budget, over infrastructure, over policy.
They were effectively neutralizing the votes of the growing urban populations.
Completely. And the court's justification for avoiding this, which was textbook judicial restraint, was rooted in some early 1900s case law, specifically a case called Colgrove v. Green and even earlier precedents.
So what was the argument?
The pre-1962 courts categorized these mapping issues as political questions. The prevailing legal rationale was that reapportionment, the drawing of the maps, was purely the prerogative of the legislative branch.
So judges shouldn't get involved.
Right. The courts argued that judges had no business stepping into this political thicket, as they famously called it.
Why not?
Largely because they felt there were no specific, manageable judicial standards for drawing political maps. How would a judge decide where one line goes versus another? And they felt that intervening would constitute a gross violation of the separation of powers.
So they were saying, in essence, this is a messy political problem that should be solved by politicians, not by us judges.
That was the line. But by maintaining that restraint, they allowed this massive structural injustice of vote dilution to persist for generations.
Because the political branches were either unwilling or really unable to correct it. Those in power benefited from the unequal status quo.
Of course, the legislature had zero incentive to redraw maps that would dilute their own power base.
And that inability to self-correct is the exact moment that judicial restraint becomes so problematic.
It's the tipping point. When a branch of government refuses to uphold a foundational principle like equal representation and the political system is completely locked in, the court's avoidance, its silence, is no longer just deference.
It's functionally a form of complicity in the injustice.
Absolutely. Then came the dramatic activist intervention in 1962 with Baker v. Carr.
So the plaintiff argued that this gross inequality violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause.
And the U.S. Supreme Court, in what was a stunning and aggressive break from its own decades-long precedent, accepted the case.
What was the exact legal finding that enabled this shift? How did they get around the political question doctrine?
They explicitly dismantled the shield of the political question defense, at least in this context. Their core ruling was that the issue of unequal representation wasn't merely a non-justiciable political matter.
It was a constitutional matter.
It was one involving a claim under the 14th Amendment, which mandates equal protection under the law for all persons. Their ruling held that equal protection issues are judicial questions, not political ones.
That one sentence is the entire philosophical pivot point.
It is.
By declaring it a judicial question, the court asserted its authority, injected itself into the deepest political machinations of the states, and essentially compelled legislative fairness.
An unelected body, the court, suddenly became the ultimate guarantor of democratic equality. This is the definitive moment the switch flips from restraint to activism.
It's an act of judicial courage.
A huge one. It's the court recognizing that the constitutional right to equality of the vote overrides the traditional deference owed to the legislature in matters of reapportionment. And this intervention led directly to the subsequent decisions that codified that fundamental principle we all know now.
One person, one vote.
That's where it comes from.
The transformative impact of this judicial activism is, it's undeniable. It's a textbook example of intervention that was necessary to protect constitutional rights that had been systematically suppressed by the political actors themselves.
It launched what historians call the reapportionment revolution.
And the revolution was immediate. States across the entire country were forced to redraw their legislative maps. It dramatically shifted political power from rural areas to the growing urban and suburban centers.
And this changed everything. It changed how resources were allocated, how taxes were structured, who held power for the next 60 years.
But this does raise a crucial and I think challenging question for you, the listener. Wasn't the court, in fact, overreaching?
It's the classic critique of the decision.
Right. An unelected body of 9 judges effectively told hundreds of state legislatures how they must structure their internal democracy.
Isn't that the very definition of stepping on the toes of the Democratic majority? It absolutely is, and that's why it's criticized as activism. But the justification, and this connects right back to Umar's famine ruling, is that the circumstances were extraordinary.
This system was broken.
The court argued that the legislative system had proven utterly incapable of correcting a fundamental rights violation, the dilution of the vote, because the very people who benefited from the injustice were the ones in charge of the legislative remedy.
So the only available recourse was judicial.
It was the only way. The court argued it wasn't legislating new policy. It was simply enforcing the explicit guarantee of equal protection that was already written into the Constitution.
It connects perfectly. The strict legal structure, in this case the political question doctrine, was the rule for ordinary times. But when that structure allowed systemic injustice to become entrenched, the circumstances became extraordinary, demanding judicial activism in the service of constitutional equity.
The court acted, as our sources suggest, not to dominate democracy, but to save its core principle from itself.
Okay, so if Baker v. Carr showed activism was needed to protect political equality against a legislative failure, our next parallel case is really fascinating.
It is. It's drawn from Pakistan's legal history, and it demonstrates activism needed to protect the public interest and human rights, often against executive abuse and systemic governance failures.
We're talking about the unique and powerful development of public interest litigation, or PIL.
This model of judicial intervention, where courts take on a much more proactive role as constitutional watchdogs, is particularly fascinating in the context of, emerging democracies.
And the sources pinpoint its clear launch with a specific case. Benazir Bhutto v. Federation of Pakistan in 1988. What was the political and legal context at the time that necessitated such a bold move from the court?
The context was one of political instability and a long history of executive overreach, particularly under non-democratic regimes. Now, the legal system that Pakistan inherited from the British was based on traditional common law.
And that required strict locus standi.
Exactly.
Okay, wait. So locus standi. That's basically the legal idea that you have to have skin in the game, right? You have to be directly and personally harmed to be able to sue someone.
That's the one. And it worked fine for, say, commercial disputes between two companies, but it was a massive barrier to justice for marginalized people or for broad public issues.
How so? Give us an example.
Okay, so imagine a factory is polluting a river. It's affecting 1,000 villagers downstream. Under the old rules, those villagers often lacked the resources, the education, or the direct individualized legal standing to sue this powerful entity.
So each person would have to prove how that specific pollution harmed them personally,
Yeah.
which is almost impossible.
It's impossible. So the poor, the environment, human rights issues, they often went completely undefended because the victims couldn't afford the process or they just weren't legally recognized to initiate the complex legal fight.
So the law remained silent, not because the law itself was unclear, but because access to the courthouse door was impossible for the victims.
And that created the extraordinary circumstance that demanded judicial action. The 1988 Benazir Bhutto ruling was pivotal because it fundamentally reinterpreted the Supreme Court's own powers.
How to do that?
It asserted that its constitutional authority allowed it to protect citizens' rights broadly, not just on a case-by-case basis. The Supreme Court established this highly proactive principle that dramatically expanded its reach. It said, where fundamental rights are threatened, the court must intervene.
That phrasing, that's a legal mandate for activism.
It is.
It transforms the court from a passive, reactive body that just waits for two private parties to bring a dispute into a proactive guardian of constitutional rights, capable of initiating action on its own based on public policy failure.
And the ruling essentially broadened the concept of locus standing whenever fundamental rights were at stake. The court declared it could treat a simple letter written by a concerned citizen, a newspaper clipping, or a report from a human rights organization as a formal petition. This created the modern era of public interest litigation. It was judicial action aimed squarely at addressing systemic inequalities and major governance deficit.
And the sources detail how this new doctrine just expanded rapidly throughout the 1990s and 2010s, especially under some very high-profile chief justices.
It did.
And this wasn't just about big political cases. It became pervasive in daily life.
The expansion was incredibly broad and deep, and it turned the Supreme Court into a highly engaged policy monitor. They used this new power, this PIL, to intervene in a huge range of areas.
Like what?
For one, environmental rights. The court basically declared that clean air and clean water were fundamental rights, and then used that to force compliance on polluting industries that the executive branch was ignoring.
Okay, what else?
Electoral fairness. Going beyond just drawing maps, like in the U.S., they intervened in issues like voter registration and transparency in the election process. Also, human rights abuses. The court started taking what's called suo motu notice.
Meaning on its own motion?
On its own motion, exactly. They would see a news report about terrible prison conditions or child labor or police brutality, and they would just open a case themselves.
Without waiting for a victim to file a lawsuit.
Correct. And finally, and most famously, corruption oversight. The court took very strong stances against high-level corruption and the misuse of public funds, stepping in where the executive accountability mechanisms had totally failed.
So it really looks like the judiciary is stepping in to fill these enormous accountability gaps that were left by a fragile political and executive system.
That is the philosophical engine driving this entire doctrine.
Where the political will to enforce regulations or tackle corruption was just, often absent.
Yes. And the rationale is captured in one very powerful statement that came out of the court. Silence of the judiciary is denial of justice.
That's a strong statement.
It is. It means that in the face of endemic poverty, executive inertia, and the voiceless nature of the marginalized, the court is seen as having a positive duty to speak up. Restraint in these specific systemic contexts is viewed not as constitutional deference, but as a moral failure.
It's seen as complicity in the denial of justice.
Precisely.
It's a compelling argument, but this is the point where the distinction between activism and overreach becomes absolutely crucial.
The razor's edge.
Right. When a court takes over environmental regulation or corruption oversight, how do they avoid crossing the line and becoming the actual executive body, micromanaging the government?
This is the critical line we must define. So activism is the court defining or enforcing a right. For instance, saying, you must clean up this river because the right to a healthy environment is fundamental.
Okay, that's defining the what.
Exactly. Overreach is when the court goes beyond defining the right and starts performing the executive function. That's defining the how.
So saying something like, you must use this specific budget line item, hire this specific contractor, and build this specific treatment plant by next Tuesday.
That's overreach.
Really?
The court's job is to define what is owed, not how to pay the debt.
And did the court recognize this danger?
It did. Recognizing this inherent danger, the Pakistani courts, just like Califumar, built in a crucial component of restraint. They issued clear warnings against judicial excess.
Mm.
The sources reference the Pakistan steel mills case from 2006, which cautioned that judicial activism must not become judicial overreach.
That warning is so essential because judicial overreach doesn't just strain the relationship between the branches of government. Crucially, it undermines the court's own legitimacy.
How so?
Well, when judges fail at administering policy, which they inevitably will since they don't have the expertise, the bureaucracy, or the funding, their failures are then interpreted by the public as failures of justice itself. It damages their core function.
And the parallel to the early caliphate is undeniable here. The mandate to intervene when fundamental rights are threatened is tempered by the warning to restrain themselves from taking over governance.
Or else the system descends into a form of judicial tyranny.
It does. It requires both the courage to act and the humility to know one's own limits.
So we have now spanned 3 massive legal frameworks: the early Islamic Caliphate, the post-war American constitutional system, and modern South Asian jurisprudence.
And yet every single system faces and ultimately defines its success by how it manages this single tension.
It's time now to synthesize these elements and deliver the core unifying legal philosophy to the listener.
It is truly striking that despite the vast differences in time, culture, and the foundational laws, be they religious or secular, the historical and doctrinal parallels are so distinct and so clear.
It really confirms that the search for justice is inherently a universal moral and legal problem.
It is.
So let's look at the activism side by side. We see these clear, decisive moments of judicial courage where the system required intervention to prevent a massive injustice.
Absolutely. The activism examples are these incredible moments when the law, if it were strictly and mechanically applied, would produce a systemic injustice. Let's lay them out.
Okay.
1. Umar suspending had and famine. This was the intervention of equity over technicality. He prioritized human survival over the strict letter of the penal code because the circumstances were extraordinary.
2. Baker v. Carr opening up political questions.
Right. This was the activist recognition that justice must trump political deference when constitutional rights are being fundamentally compromised. It's what gave us the one person, one vote principle.
And 3. The Benazir Bhutto case launching PIL in Pakistan.
And that mandated judicial activism to protect fundamental rights against systematic executive or corporate abuse, turning the court into a proactive guardian against the powerful.
So in every single one of these cases, the court chose to speak rather than remain silent when human dignity or constitutional equality or just basic survival were at stake.
They recognize that the context rendered the technical law insufficient, or in some cases, actively counterproductive to the goal of justice.
Okay, now let's look at the flip side, which is the restraint component, because that's equally vital to the integrity of the whole system.
It is. Without restraint, activism just becomes tyranny. So let's line those up as well.
Go ahead.
1. Umar warning his judges not to pry into hidden faults. This is a clear, early mandate against judicial overreach into private life or moral policing. Restraint here preserves liberty.
2. The earlier U.S. courts avoiding political questions.
Now, while we know that ultimately became flawed in the context of voting rights, it was initially driven by a necessary caution against stepping outside constitutional bounds and legislating from the bench.
A fear of overreach.
A genuine fear of overreach. And 3. The Pakistan Supreme Court cautioning against overreach in cases like the Pakistan steel mills case.
And this is the modern, pragmatic caution against the court taking on executive functions, ensuring the judiciary doesn't lose its unique role and its legitimacy.
Right.
This highlights a really crucial distinction for me. Restraint becomes destructive when it enables a fundamental injustice to fester, like in pre-Baker America.
Mm-hmm.
But restraint remains essential when it prevents the court from becoming a new form of tyranny, as warned by both Umar and the Pakistani Supreme Court.
That is the essential insight. The goal is not perpetual action or perpetual inaction, it's situational awareness. And here, I really have to acknowledge the source of this insightful comparative analysis that we're using.
Please do.
It was authored by the constitutional and corporate lawyer, Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir. Mr. Mir's synthesis provides the perfect intellectual framework for identifying the ratio decidendi.
The decisive reasoning.
The decisive reasoning that unites these disparate legal histories.
So, Mr. Mir's analysis allows us to identify that singular ethical thread that unites these diverse legal systems. What is the core lesson about judicial ethics for our learner? What's the takeaway?
The core lesson, derived directly from this comparative jurisprudence, is the principle that really defines the necessary wisdom of the bench. And it is this. When the law is silent, courts must speak. When the law is clear, courts must obey.
That is the aha moment. That's what ties the famine suspension in the 7th century to the reapportionment revolution of the 20th.
It does.
So judicial ethics is not about choosing activism or restraint as some kind of permanent ideology.
No, not at all. It is about possessing the profound wisdom required to distinguish between those two moments. The moment the law is clearly sufficient and must be respected, that's when you obey. And the moment the law is silent or is actively failing to address a fundamental injustice, that's when you must speak.
This elevates the role of the judge beyond being a mere functionary. I mean, it demands real judgment, courage, and that situational awareness you mentioned.
It does. If the legislature is functioning and upholding rights, the law is followed. If constitutional rights are being violated, or if the political system is locked into a state of failure, then the court must, by its very mandate, intervene.
Let's briefly summarize the unique contribution that each of these civilizations made to this global philosophy.
Okay. First, Islam, through the jurisprudence of Caliph Umar, provided the conceptual foundation for wise situational judgment. It set the earliest balanced template between the strict rule and the equitable exception, which serves as a moral compass for all subsequent systems.
Second, the USA demonstrated how a mature constitutional court can execute a revolutionary self-correction. It expanded justice into highly sensitive political domains when foundational democratic rights were being threatened by decades of legislative inaction.
And third, Pakistan forged this dynamic and highly accessible model of activism PIL that was specifically aimed at protecting fundamental human rights against chronic executive failure and corruption. It gave the common person a powerful mechanism to challenge government overreach in a developing political context.
So, taken together, they offer a unified philosophy. Courts must seek to protect justice where other mechanisms fail.
They must neither dominate democracy through perpetual overreach nor abandon it through cowardly inaction. They have to find the balance.
This deep dive, which was driven by the materials provided by Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir, has shown us that justice is not, as I think many people believe, some cold machine capable of purely mechanical application.
No, it's an art.
It's inherently a balancing act, and it requires profound ethical wisdom from those who sit on the bench.
And we've thoroughly charted the danger zones that are inherent in either extreme. Too much judicial restraint becomes silence. And silence in the face of systemic injustice is, unequivocally, a denial of justice itself.
And that leads to entrenched inequality, as we saw so clearly in pre-Baker v. Carr America.
And conversely, too much judicial activism becomes a form of tyranny. It becomes judicial overreach.
Right, where unelected judges start legislating from the bench, executing policy, and running government departments, which undermines the democratic legitimacy of the entire political system.
So the moral for you, the learner, is clear. True justice demands wisdom. It demands the acute ability to identify the precise moment when deference is necessary to preserve the separation of powers, and the precise moment when intervention is mandatory to protect a constitutional or a fundamental human right.
And as we conclude, we have to acknowledge that this principle, that when the law is silent, the court must speak, is a continuous mandate. It's not just a historical footnote.
Not at all.
We've seen courts successfully intervene on voting rights and on environmental rights, often after decades of those exact issues being classified as political questions.
So think about the massive, complex, global crises that currently dominate our world. Crises that are often dismissed by courts today as political questions because they seem too broad, too complex, or too expensive to solve judicially.
What are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of global climate migration, where entire nations face existential threats, or the massive regulatory gaps surrounding the right to privacy in the age of algorithmic governance and AI, or the rules of warfare involving autonomous weapon systems.
These are all areas where the law is struggling to keep up with reality.
It's silent. So we leave you with this provocative thought. What modern global crisis that is currently considered a political thicket or an untouchable political question might eventually reach a tipping point?
The moral equivalent of Umar's famine or the gross vote dilution in Tennessee.
Exactly. What contemporary failure will eventually require a court's active intervention to protect a fundamental human right, necessitating the next great and undoubtedly controversial moment of judicial activism?
We encourage you to keep exploring that universal tension.
Because the law will always demand that balance.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive. We'll see you next time.